Welcome. I'm your host, Henri Arslanian, and welcome to the Future of Money podcast. My goal with this podcast is very simple. It's to go deep in some of the biggest ideas, trends, and developments we are seeing in the field of crypto, and hopefully empower you with this information and then let you make your own decision on what their impact can be on the future of money and finance. To do this, I invite each week one of the leading figures of the global crypto community to have a one-on-one conversation amongst crypto aficionados and discuss some of these topics. My guest today is John Wu, president of Ava Labs. One thing you may not know about John is that he played competitive sports, baseball and football in college. But also he's been having this entrepreneurial and tech side of him since the early days. Believe it or not, he was one of the first kids in the neighborhood to have the Commodore 64 and start programming in BASIC. I'm sure these are skills that come in very handy even today. John, great to have you with us today on the Future of Money podcast.
Oh, Henry, it's a pleasure to be here. I always like chatting with you. It's been some time. I'm glad we can do this.
Absolutely. Where are you now, actually, John? Where are you physically right now?
So physically, I'm in the U.S. in the New York area. It's it's bright. This is modern technology. It's like I just woke up literally like 15, 20 minutes ago. And I know you're about to go to sleep because you're on the other side of the world in Asia. But without technology, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing right now.
Exactly. I'm actually in Hong Kong in a hotel room. For those of you watching this podcast on YouTube, I'm stuck in a hotel room. Everybody that comes into Hong Kong, we have to go to this 14-day mandatory hotel quarantine, despite being vaccinated, of course. But it is what it is. The important thing, John, we're here today. As the episode we have today is part of our deep dive series that we have, where really the goal is to share with our listeners, feature some of the different protocols and tokens out there, to educate them and understand how they're different from others. So we're very happy to have you and be able to feature today Avalanche from that perspective. But before we talk about Avalanche, Ava Labs, and everything else around the ecosystem, maybe can you just share with our audience a bit about yourself, your personal journey, your background, and how you ended up at Ava Labs as well?
Sure. So as you said, something that people don't know about me, I had two passions growing up. It was sports and it was technology and playing around in both of them. When I grew up and became an adult and was ready to apply to college and do things in a career and professionally, I realized, yes, sports and technology. But what I really loved, the underlying characteristics, especially in sports, was playing in a team and having other people that I can work with and build things together and also lead people and also getting them to be the best versions of themselves. And in return, they made me better as well. I love the communications, the people, and working together. And on the technology side, what I really loved, frankly, I realized was innovation. And it could be in technology. It could be in business models. It can be in new ways to market. I just love new things and emerging concepts. And I love to study all of that stuff. So I went to college, and I played some sports in college, as you said. And then after college, I was a technology investor. Tiger Management was one place I was at. Then I went to business school. And afterwards, I was at Kingdon Capital and then ultimately started my own technology firm. But, as an investor, you learn so much. And you have this treasure hunt every day of trying to find the newest and greatest emerging technology company to invest in. You study people, you study business models, you study how they do it, how they motivate. That was super exciting. And then when I saw blockchain and crypto, I got in personally first as an investor in fairness in 2014 after the Mt. Gox crash for Bitcoin. But then in 2017 was my next aha moment in this space. In 2017, as you all probably remember, there was this gigantic thing called ICOs. And it was great in the sense that it created more adoption in the space. And for me, the aha moment was like, wait a second, this is very similar to an IPO or even types of venture funding. And I think this global crowdfund, what was astonishing was this use case was the first thing that was actually, in my opinion, a use case of some sort. And I looked at it, I was like, wait, but in the US, these raises are effectively private securities and are effectively illegal. There's the Securities Acts of 1933 and 1934, and this did not comply, frankly. So I became an operator in, this is now 4 or 5 years ago, I guess. And I wanted to make it compliant. I was CEO of this company in California. And then what I realized then was that even if we made this work, and it was working from a reg tech perspective, but commercially the world wasn't ready to adopt security tokens, if you will. The systems that existed out there, and primarily Ethereum at the time, if this really worked and you had the traditional volume and the transactions and all of that in the traditional financial world, and you just put it onto a blockchain world at the time in a permissionless manner, at the time it was clear to me that it would not scale. There was no way that you can do this properly. So what theoretically was going to be more efficient would pragmatically not be. And one thing led to another. Eamon Gunseer, the founder, the distributed systems professor from Cornell University, he saw this from a technology perspective. He's in old guard, so to speak, in this space. He had actually invented some consensus protocols and cryptocurrencies even before Bitcoin. They didn't take off like Bitcoin, but he's a I would call him a godfather of the space, if you will. And some people even say he's been cited second only to Satoshi, whoever he or they are. He saw the problem from a different spectrum, a technology perspective, and he went about solving that. And I joined ultimately Ava Labs, the team behind Avalanche, as president in the very, very early days. Since then, it's been a hell of a ride, a lot of fun. I love leading people. I love building in a hyper growth environment. We've had great backers like Polychain, Initialized Capital, and Andreessen Horowitz, you name it. And there's a whole bunch of, traditional venture as well as crypto venture capital companies supporting. And we have an incredible community. And I'm proud to say, we're one of the top teams out there and supporting the Avalanche protocol.
So let's go into the detail, John. I mean, obviously you mentioned some of the other protocols, and obviously there's different layer one solutions out there in the market. You mentioned Ethereum, but there's obviously many others from Solana to Algorand, right? I mean, let's dive into the different components of how Avalanche is different, so that our audience can understand how it's actually the special features that set it apart. So let's start actually from, let's say, performance. Can you maybe share with us, how is Avalanche different from other layer one blockchains when it comes to performance? I know, for example, you guys mentioned that it's one of the fastest smart contract platforms out there, when measured from time to finality. But can you maybe explain to us what that means and give us some data as well for our audience to understand?
Sure. So you mentioned two metrics there. Basically, I think you mentioned TPS as well as finality. So TPS is transactions per second. Avalanche, the protocol that Ava Labs supports, is over 4,500 TPS. Ethereum right now is about 1415 TPS. So there's far more scale. Then there's also the finality aspect. Finality is when a settlement and in a transaction, when a settlement and payment kind of what is a lag, so to speak. So with the latest upgrades to Avalanche, it's actually almost instant finality. It's not even 2 seconds. It's milliseconds now. But I think there's a misconception of using TPS simply as a gauge for speed. That's commonly done for various reasons, but it really it's not exactly the same. I look at TPS more as thinking about as capacity, whereas finality is closer to speed. It's kind of like if you had a pizza shop, Henry, and you found out that humanly and the ovens or whatever, you can only bake or make a pizza in a half hour. That was the amount of time it took. And then you hired 20 pizza makers or chefs, and over the course of a day, you can make 960 pizzas. It doesn't mean that it's faster. It just means there's more capacity when you hire more people. So I think that's very important to distinguish out there. I hate to say also, some people count TPS differently. Most people who would be true to the word of transaction per second only count transactions. I know there are not quite the standards of measurement yet. So sometimes people count transactions, including messages. Like, a message is not really a transaction. So how is Avalanche different now that we have that context in mind? So first of all, it has one of the highest TPS out there, far faster than Ethereum, we already talked about it. And bar none, I don't think there is another first layer protocol that has this instant finality component. So that is actually a very important thing, because if you think about decentralized finance, and I know we're probably going to get into this later, you need that settlement payment instant finality concept. Right now, when you go and you purchase with your credit card anything from a store, there's a lag between when you get that item, whatever you're purchasing, and the time the merchant actually gets paid from the banks via the networks, the existing legacy networks. And for that, the merchant actually ends up paying 2% for that. And sometimes there's snags between those two things, and ultimately the merchant has to eat even more costs. And in that system, embedded in their pricing, ultimately the consumer has to pay for it. So in a world where there's instant finality, it really attracts a lot of developers. That has been one of the advantages for Avalanche with this instant finality concept. In decentralized finance, especially anything with payments, finance, assets, that value that needs to be moved, people want to know right away that they got what they wanted and the pay was there. So that's a huge advantage, and that's a big difference between Avalanche, the protocol, and other protocols.
I like your pizza store analogy, right? I mean, you can have as many people making pizzas, but if the oven has capacity, what you're referring to as speed, like for the finality, there's the bottleneck, which is there as well, right? I mean, it's interesting because I think maybe for a benefit of our audience, even with Bitcoin, for example, every 10 minutes we have a new block, but often you need to wait a couple of blocks in order to have that kind of finality if you want. The same thing with Ethereum, which I think is a couple minutes now. But again, this finality element you mentioned is very, very interesting. And so I like the distinction between capacity and speed. Let's move on to security, because I know one of the big talking points, if you want, a lot of the Avalanche, Maxis, if you want, talk also about the security element. Of course, I think Avalanche is on a proof of stake consensus mechanism. But can you mention, I mean, what in one new way makes the Avalanche network more secure than other, let's take other layer one solutions. Let's take Ethereum and others, for example.
Well, I mean, a lot of people who are attracted to the blockchain crypto world, they believe in decentralization and distributed. And it's obvious when validators and nodes are more decentralized, you have less risk in terms of hacking and other things and malicious activity. So therefore, decentralization and validation is effectively more security. But it does come at a cost sometimes. If the consensus protocol is not strong or the system is not strong, you could sacrifice some scale. And that's been part of this, one of the two components of, I guess, of the trilemma, as they like to call it, and that people have always been trying to flex in terms of how much decentralization and how much security that they would sacrifice. So again, Eamon Gunsier, the founders and the PhD students he worked with at Cornell, saw this problem, and they went on their mission to basically solve this and minimize the sacrifices on security. What they did was actually create what we think is another entire new paradigm in terms of consensus protocols. And I think we'll get into this later. You already said you want to talk about it, so I'll save it for later. But therefore, Avalanche has the ability to validate with thousands of nodes and possibly even millions of nodes and sacrifice nothing in terms of scalability.
Let's talk about that, John. I know it's obviously the consensus mechanism, and being the nerd that I am, and also for my next book as well. I spend the time actually reading some of these white papers as well. And of course, with Avalanche, we talk about is obviously the BFT, like the Byzantine fault tolerance, but we guys call it leaderless. Maybe can you explain for our listeners what do you mean by that, by leaderless BFT, but also how is it different from other Byzantine fault tolerance mechanisms out there that are used actually quite commonly across the crypto ecosystem?
Avalanche so achieves a proof of stake via, as you said, leaderless Byzantine fault tolerance. And basically it's using a gossip algorithm. And the consensus is achieved by, frankly, a probabilistic conclusion during the gossip process where the network of participants can achieve that agreement very quickly. If I use I guess a football stadium analogy, if there's like a lot of people in the stadium and some people say yes, some people say no. There's a random sampling of someone who's going to be the surveyor. And if you're choosing groups of 5 people, if 3 out of the 5 say yes, then they tip over yes, and so does the surveyor. And then it's simultaneously groups of 5 with the surveyor. And ultimately it tips over one way that it's either yes or no, or you can use colors, blue or green, and you get to a consensus that way. So that's what we mean by leaderless. There are a lot of proof of stake protocols. They do rely on a leader, and usually that leader is the person that has the most dollar value in their staking mechanism. So sometimes there are protocols out there that they can say they have hundreds or maybe even 1,000 validators out there, but there's only like 3 or 4, maybe 5 at most 10 of these validators that have most of the staking power, and they end up getting most of the rewards. So even though they technically do have many nodes and many people validating, reality is that leader, or the ones with the most value, who are getting most of the rewards or all of the rewards sometimes, those are the guys really making the decisions. And ultimately what that means is it is not as decentralized, and there's higher risk that those nodes, like in a centralized server, can be attacked and malicious things can happen. In fact, just recently there was one of these protocols that went down for a while because of that very reason.
Yeah, I think we know what you're referring to from that perspective. But it's interesting because this leaderless concept, I wish we had more time in the podcast, but I know, for example, Algorand is under one where they have this kind of leaderless mechanism. And again, I don't think we have time to go through this the detail today. But maybe let me ask you a stupid question linked to this. I know that one. A lot of the material that Avalanche put forward, both in the, let's say, the literature, but also in the marketing material, you talk about an 80% safety threshold, which is obviously higher than the typical 51%, attack that we talk, let's say, not only in Bitcoin, but other cryptocurrencies as well. So how is that 80%? I mean, it's one of the first times that I see that there's an 80% instead of being a 51% attack. Can you maybe share for our listeners where does the 80% come from?
So, let's think about this. There was, like I said earlier, there's been a couple of paradigm shifts in consensus mechanisms. The very early one was the classical consensus, and that's been in distributed systems for over 40 years. From a communication perspective, it is everyone has to talk to everyone else. So although that is great, it sometimes leads to the n square problem, if you will. Once you get to about 100 or so, it just slows down. And in that classical system, if attacker is able to gain about a third of the control, a third of the network, they can launch what they call a double spend attack, which is almost going to be guaranteed to succeed. So what you want to do is have a number, a threshold that is higher, so that you need to basically gain control of more of the system in order to do something malicious. So then Nakamoto came around, and this is what you were referring to earlier when you said the 50%. So he did away, or whoever Nakamoto or Satoshi was, they did away with the requirement for all-to-all communication. And as such, it was perfect for an open and permissionless setting where basically any node can join the system at any time. And ultimately, that led to a system where there was minimal security loss and an increase, some other, the other benefits we talked in the trilemma. And ultimately, you need to attack over 50% in order to be successful in a double spend attack. So the Avalanche consensus, it effectively took some of the best parts of the classical and some of the best parts of the Nakamoto consensus, and with a lot of math and a lot of call it hard work in an academic setting with a lot of PhD students and Eamon Kunsir, the professor, they came up with a random sampling consensus protocol. And this, I think for your readers, we don't have time on this. They should go to the Ava Labs website and learn more about it and learn it straight from Gun. He's been on podcasts. He's been on YouTube channels, and he's talked about it a lot. So they should learn the technology underneath it from him directly. But for the more business oriented people, what is important here is that it solves a lot of that communications problem without sacrificing that scale. And now it's a case where it's like, okay, even if the network was attacked up to 80%, the double spend problem won't happen.
Interesting. I think it's very interesting from a contribution perspective, how that 80% works. Actually, let's move. You mentioned business. Let's move to the business side, John. A couple of elements I want to talk about. One of them is obviously within the Algorand community, one of the big attributes that is often mentioned is the fact that Avalanche is actually interoperable with Ethereum and is compatible also with Solidity, which is obviously a big plus for Avalanche. How does that work? I mean, so can you share with our audience how does interoperability with Ethereum work, and the fact that actually Solidity is compatible as well?
Avalanche basically has 3 chains, a network of chains. And one of the chains is Ethereum compatible. So the Ethereum virtual machine, it's compatible. So therefore what that means is developers who know how to program in Solidity, assets that are programmed and made on the Ethereum blockchain, any project built on Ethereum can be now built on Avalanche with the same logic. And users can also move Ethereum assets over our bridge, the AB bridge, onto Avalanche. It's actually one of the best features or things that's out there. It's probably the easiest bridge to use. So I encourage everyone on listening to actually try that and compare that experience with other bridges. So it's interoperable with Ethereum and compatible in the sense with Solidity because developers can actually continue to program how they do it on Avalanche, on Ethereum, on Avalanche, and the assets that are being used on Ethereum can easily move over to Avalanche. And that's, I think that is a great competitive advantage because it's kind of like, I don't know, Henry, you may be of similar vintage, and you probably remember this when you were a young kid like myself. There was this war between VHS and Sony Betamax. And Sony Betamax was a vertically integrated, everything from the production of the movie to the distribution of the tapes. It used to be literally tapes. Whereas VHS was more of a consortium and it was open to all. And ultimately, because of that and the network effects, VHS won. Some still argue today that Betamax was a better technology from Sony, but it didn't really get the liftoff that it needed. So I think the point here is, Henry, from a business perspective, we want the whole space to grow. Ethereum is an incredible ecosystem. That was what we think was the second generation of crypto and blockchain. The first was obviously Bitcoin, and it's built a great audience. And if that audience wants more functionality, there's a whole new third generation of first layer protocols. You've mentioned Algorand, obviously Avalanche, which are all great supplements or actually complements of Ethereum.
So actually, let's talk about that. Obviously, with Avalanche, there's this big 3 areas of focus you guys often talk about, right? There's DeFi, the entire world of decentralized finance. There's all the institutional side with enterprises and governments, and there's collectibles. From these 3 big areas of focus, John, what are the ones where you're seeing have the most traction within the Avalanche community?
So, three areas of focus. I may characterize them slightly differently, but I think you've gotten the gist of it. It all goes back to the ultimate mission. The mission is to digitize the world's assets on blockchains to help that movement happen. So the DeFi is where there is the most utility right now. I think there's close to 250 billion of TVL now in the ecosystem. So using that as a metric, that's where there's most utility in the blockchain ecosystem. Avalanche, I'm happy to report, is well over 11 billion. I think if you look at any of the third-party reporting sources out there, that is now literally top 3 or 4 in terms of chains that have activity in decentralized finance, with well over I think 400 or 500 integrated live applications. Then there's like hundreds of other applications still in the process of getting integrated. That is very important because that is building the foundation for another effort here. Remember, we want to digitize the world's assets. It's not just the 250 billion of DeFi, but it's the 700 trillion of traditional assets and financial assets that sit on either banks or financial services firms out there. So in order to do that, DeFi is a good way to build product, learn, and create the functionality that's necessary to also help institutions, enterprises, governments, financial services firms one day digitize their assets. In fact, Avalanche just announced that they have a partnership with Deloitte, and we're very proud of this. It's been a long, I know, you're a PwC guy, but, and Deloitte is somewhat of a competitor, but Deloitte, just like PwC, is one of the most storied consulting firms out there. They do a lot of work with governments and other enterprises. Avalanche is the only chain that is part of this alliance. They've already rolled out a product, the CAYG, Close As You Go product, that is helping FEMA in natural disasters in various countries. So our work in the crypto native stuff like DeFi has led us to be able to help huge organizations like Deloitte and governments achieve efficiency, workflow efficiency, as well as data management, and actually give them even more security in this permissionless way and make things happen instantaneously. So that is the second part of what you said we were achieving, and that's in line. Let's learn, let's build, let's be good here, and then let's use those learnings and help even a bigger TAM, if you will.
Very exciting, actually.
What was the third thing you said that we're focused on?
No, it was DeFi, then obviously the institutional market, and of course then collectibles, the whole world.
Oh, okay. So NFTs and stuff like that. That's awesome.
What are you seeing with NFTs and within the Avalanche community?
That is a lot of fun, Henry. So I think NFTs, people, and that's why you said collectibles. I guess, people view it as like, digital collectibles. It's a lot more than that. NFTs is really, changing business models. It's really, letting people, sure, it is definitely transferring rights of ownership of either physical art or native crypto art and making it unique and non-fungible token on blockchains that has more transparency so other people can see that you own it. That is just like the base case. But the potential for identification for business models, the potential for how artists themselves can reinvent the value chain of how they sell tickets and how they can increase loyalty with their fan base. All of that is exciting. That's another area where naturally traditional vertical industry people are now gravitating to crypto and using this NFT kind of style of things and creating social tokens, gaming tokens. And there's this big intersection now between NFTs as well as gaming and social tokens and new use cases being popped up every day. So in line with the mission, we want assets to be on the Avalanche and we want adoption. So minting or printing an asset and digitizing it on a blockchain is no different for a financial services product or it is for a piece of art or something like that. So what we see right now, and this is fascinating, Henry, it's cool that Avalanche is one of the top, blockchains out there because it's kind of like inverting the VC pyramid in a way because projects and deals come straight to us for help. Avalanche, the foundation, is not just a investor. I call it's not just a transactional capital. It's relationship capital. So like I said before, we see like thousands of projects coming to us and we try to help as many as we can that are legit. We vet them. We look at them, Ava Labs, that is. And then the ones that we can invest in, that's great. And then the ones that we can help, whether it's like helping them build a community, helping them market, helping them with biz dev relationships, and introducing them to other projects that make them better. Sometimes matching entrepreneurs, helping them integrate into the Avalanche blockchain. all of those things give Ava Labs and Avalanche a competitive advantage of seeing what's out there. And this ties up to the collectibles, as you call it, or I call it social tokens, because it's really morphing as to the functionality. There is just so much going on. The flow of inflow and the interest from that part, from my vantage point as an operator, is incredible right now.
Where is on the DeFi side, actually, what are kind of the use cases you're seeing being built on the Avalanche platform, on DeFi in particular? Maybe in 30 seconds, quickly on that point.
Sure. It is, a big picture wise, all the traditional financial products and services you see in traditional finance are now being built. That is swapping of assets. Think of that in the traditional world as more like an exchange or marketplace. It is lending, borrowing, derivatives, now insurance. So all the stuff that you have in the traditional is now being developed and built in the DeFi ecosystems.
But I mean, on Avalanche in particular, you're seeing it's mirroring the same DeFi applications that we're seeing on Ethereum and Solana and BSV and others, basically.
So yes, I think what is interesting on the Avalanche platform is there are, because of that finality component we talked about, that instant finality, when you're dealing with financial related assets and payments, people like to know that when they bought their Tesla stock, it's not pending and that you actually bought it at the price it was when you thought you clicked the button. So there is a huge inflow of developers coming into that space on the Avalanche side. And I think what's interesting there is the applications on Avalanche. It's very deep. What I mean by that is you can have a lot of volume on New York Stock Exchange with 2 stocks, or you can have the same volume with 1,000 or 2,000 stocks. That's what's interesting about Avalanche, is that it's a very deep bucket of applications that have liquidity as opposed to concentrated buckets of activity in a few dApps.
I love it. Believe it or not, John, we're out of time, but I really want to ask you one question about the Ava token economics as well. Because I think one of the interesting things, obviously, with your token, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is one of the, obviously, on the staker fees, unlike other protocols where it's given to the elected leader, in Avalanche, actually, they are burned. So I'm just trying to understand what practical impact of the burn has when it comes to staking fees. The second, if you can touch upon on the transaction fee element as well. I know you guys, the transaction cost depends on the type of transaction. For example, you have a slotting cost function, and even some transactions have no fees. If you can really, literally, I know it's a big question, but let's say in 2 minutes, really summarize for our audience.
Okay, it's the same. It's really CPU. So certain transactions require more processing, others are simpler. So it's based on CPU usage. It's that simple, and that's great because Avalanche is a token economics is a burn and mint model. So it's a finite amount of tokens in the end, and then there's a schedule, an inflation schedule, but it's kind of like taking the best again of Bitcoin as well as Ethereum, or Ethereum as it was, where there's an emission curve, but there's a finite amount that can ultimately be minted. And the thought here is that when you burn and mint, you ultimately obviously reduce the number of coins circulating. So if Avalanche is super successful and there's a lot of adoption, there'll be a lot of burning. And in theory, it may never even get to its max emission AVAX number because there'll be more burning than there is minting at some point. So the reason why this hybrid system was set up was, again, we thought, or the guys who wrote the protocol, Gun and his team, basically thought this was the ultimate system in terms of getting liftoff velocity, incentivizing a decentralized community, as well as having good longevity. Because the way we do it, or say Avalanche, is there is no slashing. There's no risk of losing capital. And we made sure that this helps in terms of getting adoption for validation. And also the cost of hardware required to validate is also very low. You can literally do it with the Raspberry Pi instead of like having big machines. So for all those reasons, this mechanism was set up to not only help lift off for decentralization, but to continue it in the long run.
think we could have a whole another episode on the whole CPU and.
I feel like we barely touched the surface on a lot of things.
Exactly.
And,
so that's what makes it this industry interesting and fascinating from that perspective. So, John, we're going to go quickly through the fire round question. My bell is with me, and basically, I'm going to ask you quick questions. I need 1 or 2 word answers, and our bell is going to keep us honest here to make sure we keep in time. Are you ready?
I don't know, but I'll go. Let's do it.
In 1 or 2 words, what is the biggest challenge in growing the Avalanche community?
The biggest challenge is hiring people.
Which brings me to my second question. What is the best place to find talent for Avalanche Labs? What do you find is the best place to hire people?
Luckily, we've had Cornell University as a feeder, a lot of computer scientists, but also lucky for us, even though it's hard, there's a lot of inbound because there's just a lot of good things happening, a lot of interesting things, the mission. So for us, it's filtering the inbound as opposed to going and finding it ourselves.
Here we go. And also helping your alumni, your alma mater at Cornell, which is awesome. Next question. If you had to start all over again, would you start as an investor like you did, or you would do something else?
Either way, whatever I did at the moment, based on the world, it had to fulfill 2 things. And it goes back to what I love the kids, something I can work with people, communicate, talk, lead. And on this other end, I want to be part of looking at emerging technologies, either finding them and investing them or being part of one big hyper growth industry.
Beautiful. What do you do, John, when you're not busy with Ava Labs? What do you do on your weekend?
I play a lot of sports now with my kids. It's either tennis or golf. It's no longer football and baseball after many surgeries, but it's now tennis and golf.
What's your favorite YouTube channel or Netflix series?
Ooh, I wish I got to watch TV more. That's a hard one for me to answer. Usually, whatever it is, it's usually documentary type published content.
Yeah, I'm very similar to you on that sense as well. Another one on you, John. What industry would you be in? If you're not in crypto, what other industry would you love to be in?
It has to be something in hyper growth. I love fast moving things. I love studying new things. I mean, right now, besides crypto, maybe AI would be an industry where it's toward growth.
Here we go. And John, if you can have lunch with one person, dead or alive, who would it be? Lunch with one person, dead or alive?
If I can launch with one person dead or alive, well, it's Ayman Gunsir. We're living the dream right now.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean lunch as in eating, as dinner. If you could have dinner with one person.
Oh, lunch with any person ever.
I'm sure you'd launch with him as well, but like...
Well, Henry, since we're doing this on video, next time let's do it in person over lunch.
Exactly. And thanks for taking about John. It was great to have you. Where can people find you, John, if they want to get in touch with you, or how can they follow you on social media?
Thank you. I think we just tipped the iceberg here. So if you want to learn more of my opinions and what I'm thinking on Twitter, it's at JOHN, the number 1WU, John 1 Woo. Or read some of my longer blog posts and see some of my other comments at the website johnwoo.finance. And of course, go to Ava Labs, Avalanche company and foundation related websites.
That was John Woo, the president of Ava Labs. Thank you very much, John, for being with us. And thank you to the dear listeners for being listening to the other episode as well. Please make sure to click subscribe and give us a 5-star rating if you like this podcast. A new episode will be released every week. Also, if you want to stay on top of the latest developments on crypto and on the future of money, make sure to also follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter, especially for my weekly Crypto Capsule show, where I summarize some of the global crypto developments you need to know in less than 60 seconds. And also don't forget to subscribe on LinkedIn to my LinkedIn newsletter called The Future of Money, where I share the 3 big ideas that you need to know each week. And of course, for more educational content on crypto, make sure to also check out my YouTube channel, where I have not only videos of previous interviews, and the one today with John will be on as well, but also lots of other crypto educational videos. And the good news now is all my content now is not only in English, but also available in French, Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin Chinese on my various YouTube channels. So thank you very much, John, for being with us. And thank you to dear listeners for being with us today on this other episode of the Future of Money podcast. See you all next time. And John, see you soon.